Hi everyone, this is Tanya with Flying Dog Studio. Thanks so much for joining me on part 2 of painting a village with texture and shading. And in this video, as we get started, you'll see that I have my colors that I'm going to be primarily using for finishing up this piece over to the side, and I have them in their separate little areas on the palette so that you can see how I am mixing them together. On the building fronts in part 1, I added some texture with iodized salt and I kind of moved that around so it would be subtle. I'm coming back with some more color and putting that on top. And as I said in the first video, it seems counterproductive to put the texture on first, but I wanted that texture underneath because I wanted it to be subtle. I did not want it to be screaming at you texture. I want it to kind of make the buildings look old, a little bit weathered, but I didn't want it to be an extreme amount of texture. So that's what you're going to see me doing here, adding some more color to these buildings and adding some shading. Now I'm dropping in some of those darker colors at the base of the building where there is some more shadow. I'm using lots of water on my brush. So this is wet on dry. And as long as you use a lot of water on your brush with this 100% cotton paper, you're able to move that color around just a little bit more. So I'm going to let you watch me paint here and add these details, and I'll hop back on every now and then and explain what I'm doing. In part 1 of this video, I had already added some shaded areas in the piece. I put down color first, and then I put shading, and then I put more color, and now I'm putting more shading. I like to go back and forth and layer like this. Number 1, it adds depth and a little more interest to the piece. And number 2, I don't want to add a tremendous amount of color to something and then come back later and say, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. So if I slowly build up these colors on there, then I'm not oversaturating something that I'm going to have to correct later. So even though I added a lot of this shading before, I'm coming back and adding a little bit more, because remember, these colors will be darker once we put them down, and then they will lighten up as they dry. So I'm adding some of the Payne's Gray for the shadows, and you'll see me mix in a little bit of the browns. And I don't really like to use black. I will occasionally use black. The street right down in front of the building where I'm painting the door right now had a little area of almost concrete, and I did add some black to the Payne's Gray to get that texture in there, to get the correct color, and then I added salt for the texture. Once again, I'm adding some more shadows in here using lots of water on my brush, which allows it to come up into the color we've already painted. So I like to paint the lighter colors first, as I did on the front of this building. And then I came back with the darker colors. I'm just going to allow those to bleed together, just to run together. And if you use lots of water, you can do that without having to encourage them to blend together. So I always start with the lighter color and then add that darker color in to let it bleed into that color. And I'm just coming through on these pots. These pots will get some more color and make them a little bit brighter, but I'm adding that shadow in first to make sure I get that shadow. And all of these shadows that I put in earlier, as you can see, that one looks super dark now, but it will, as I just said, it will dry lighter, so we're not too worried about that. In part one of this project, as I was painting the windows, I used strictly Payne's Gray. And I told you we would come back and we'd add some more color in, so that's what I'm doing now. You know, windows, glass is a little bit tricky because it's not usually one solid color. Usually it's reflecting some light, so that's what you're seeing here. I put a little more Payne's Gray, then I'm dipping back in to my reds and some of my browns and even some yellows. And each little pane will be different because everything is reflecting something a little bit differently. And I'm adding some yellow onto the building again to put some highlights in there. I had a little bit of dark on my brush. You can see I didn't get it completely rinsed out, but that's not going to hurt my feelings. I'm just going to use that to bring down. It just gives a little more interest to the building, gives it a little more weathered look. So basically what I'm going to be doing through the rest of this is just looking for the little details. You can see I have cleaned my palette and I put down Payne's Gray. I left some of that cadmium-free yellow and I have the sap green. And as I said earlier in the part one of this video, I did not line out all of the little leaves that were in this vine, this greenery that was growing up around the door. I didn't want that to be the focal point, but I do want to acknowledge that it's there. So I have outlined basic clumps. And now I'm coming in with my smaller brush. You're getting to see me use a size 2. I don't normally use a size 2. But I'm using the size 2 on this, so I have my nice base color that has just a mixture of the sap green and the Payne's Gray and that cadmium-free yellow that I let it just blend together, just work together and do its thing. Now that it's dry, I'm coming back and I'm using the same colors to individually paint or to paint individual petal or leaves. I'll get it here in a minute. Individual leaves onto this mass of greenery. So I have a reference picture I'm looking at. I'm basically just looking where the dark areas are and where the light areas are, and then I'm doing my own thing. And that's what you really need to do with a reference picture like this. The original reference picture for this, the windows in the foreground, the building across from this, had bars that came up on half of the windows. I left those off. There was another plant or two. I thought that was just too much for this piece. I didn't want too much in the street. And there was also a little table and a couple of little chairs sitting in front of one of the windows. But again, it looked a bit too busy and I wanted to simplify it. So whenever you're using a reference photo, remember it doesn't have to be exactly like the piece. And I would tell my students that all the time. And no one's going to be taking your reference piece and holding it up against your painting on the wall saying, oh, look at all the mistakes you made. You didn't get it exactly right. As artists, we are allowed to change things and to move things and to create something a little bit different than what we're seeing on the reference. We need reference pictures to help us know what objects look like, to know perspective, to know shape, to know color, to know depth and perspective. But when we are creating, we do not have to do it exactly like the photo. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just adding this in. I'm not being too meticulous on it. I just know where the darks need to go, and I'm going straight in with Payne's Gray. And because we have those colors underneath, it is allowing me just to put Payne's Gray and it's picking up on that green. So it's not going to look just completely dark blue. It's going to have some of that green underneath and create more of a forest green. You can see I'm skipping around on this area because it is cold pressed paper. It does dry fairly quickly, and I am using that to my advantage, so that's why I'm skipping around and then coming back so that I can paint these on top of one another and they don't all bleed together. One thing I wanted to point out as far as mixing color goes, you see I have my Payne's Gray and I just added some burnt umber, and that gave me a very nice dark brown without adding black. You do not have to add black to your colors to get a darker shade. Think about what colors can work together. This is why color swatching is so important when you're working with brand new colors. Go ahead and swatch them out, and I do have a video for that. I'll try to remember to link that down below, but you can take a look at my past videos where I have swatched the colors for this Winsor & Newton half pan set, and that allows you to see what colors you can put together without relying on black or without relying on white all the time, just to get some shades and some tints. This is the brightening of those terracotta pots I told you we were going to do. As you can see, I'm putting some color on, and then I'll take a little bit of water and kind of bleed those out into the rest of the pot so that it's not there. I've got a little bit of water on my brush, and that's going to move that around for me. And I mentioned that in the last video. If you get a lot of color on something and it's just a little too much for you, a little too intense, you can always come back with some water and kind of move that color around. So I'm going to finish this up, adding some more highlights to things and bringing out those colors a bit more. And then we're going to do one final step, which is use a fine liner to get some more details. When I lined this piece originally, I used my Prismacolor brown ink to line the entire thing because I had a previous video where I used my micron. I'm using a gray micron right now. This is I believe it's a 0.01, but I used this micron for a piece and it bled when I put the water on there. It actually bled out to other stuff. And so I decided, one of my viewers actually said, you know, I use mine afterwards, and I do that too, but I like to line before. So I thought, I'm not gonna just, you know, disregard these pens. I am gonna use them, so I'm using them after the fact. So I used the Prismacolor at the beginning because I knew it did not bleed. I tried that out in another video, and I knew it was better for laying down before you put your color on. And you have to let any kind of ink dry before you come in and put watercolor on top of it. So I'm coming back and I'm getting some of these lines in that were kind of lost with the watercolor. And even though I'm mixing the inks, you really can't tell. They all just kind of look dark. So it's okay that I've used gray and brown together because they kind of work with the entire piece. So when you're coming back and lining like this, relining things, you don't want to trace around everything. You want to just pick out areas that really bring you into focus on stuff. Your mind is going to fill everything in for you. That's how pointillism works. When you have all of those little dots of color side by side, your brain just mixes those together. So that's what our brain is going to do on this. We give it just a little bit of information and our brains will go, oh, I know what you're talking about there. So they'll fill the rest of it in. So that's what I'm doing. And I am adding a little bit of hatching here and there just to make sure I have enough shading in some areas. And I wanted it to look a little loose, and I didn't feel as if I wanted to put that hatching in at the beginning. I knew I wanted to do it at the end so it would show up a little more. So that's what you're seeing here. Coming to my final marks on this piece to finish it up. Thank you so much for joining along in this journey of painting the village with texture and shading. If you have any questions or any comments, please put those down below, and I'll see you in the next one.